Joining us now, CNN chief data analyst Harry Enton. Harry, we're talking about tariffs here. You're just hearing that conversation. Has Trump's push for tariffs been successful in the minds of the American people?
An economic war has broken out. The U.S. has slapped a series of unprecedented tariffs on Canada, threatening to strike at the most crucial sectors of its economy: steel, aluminum, automobiles, and agriculture. The president, whose words sound more like orders than policy, announced new tariffs of up to 35%, forcing Canadian manufacturers to play by tough American rules or pay a heavy price. This tariff nightmare has made many wonder, is our northern neighbor really on the verge of economic collapse? But the response was immediate and unprecedentedly forceful. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, known for his cool head and strategic thinking, did not give in to panic and emotion. Instead, he bet on long-term independence, expanding trade partnerships with Asia, Europe, and, in an unexpected turn, Mexico. These steps sent a clear signal. Canada will not only survive, it is preparing for a new era of economic independence. Rumors and gossip suggest that Russia and China could become key players in Canada's new economic strategy. Behind the scenes, heated negotiations are underway involving the world's major powers, seeking to circumvent U.S. attempts to establish a monopoly on trade in the Western Hemisphere. Many experts predict that Canada and its new allies could rewrite the rules of the game on the world stage, leaving Trump as a lone player resorting to outdated tactics of pressure and ultimatums. In addition to economic issues, the topic of security has emerged at international forums. The joint fight against drug trafficking and terrorism has become the cornerstone of the recently concluded strategic partnership between Canada and Mexico. For the first time in a long time, this alliance demonstrates the powerful unity of North America, despite Washington's attempts to divide its neighbors. Behind all this lies a brutal game of political ambition. In a world where leaders trade tariffs like weapons and economic wars are fought in the fields of negotiations and government budgets, Canada is showing class and perseverance. Carney and his team have developed a plan to invest in infrastructure and manufacturing that could change the country's economic landscape for decades to come. So stay tuned, because a real drama is about to unfold on our screens. A mega battle between two economic giants. The U.S. under pressure from tough policies, and Canada, which is already building a shield of new alliances and domestic growth. The question is, will Canada emerge from this conflict not only economically intact, but stronger than ever? It remains to be seen who will win this chess game: aggressive tariffs or calculated skill and strategic thinking. The basis for the first 2 points of the plan in such a text should be a sense of immediate threat and a powerful emotional hook that links today's economic attack with the historical struggle for sovereignty. This is what gives the viewer the feeling that they are witnessing the country at a moment of trial, rather than listening to a dry overview of events. At the same time, it is important not to overdo the dramatization, relying on real facts: U.S. tariffs of up to 35%, a trade war starting in 2005. Ottawa's retaliatory measures, strengthening ties with Mexico and Asian markets, creates credibility, while fictional details enhance the atmosphere without turning the text into fantasy. In the first point, open with a strong statement about the crisis or attack. The text should begin with a tough formula that immediately sets the tone. Not strained relations, but economic attack, trade siege. Attempt to strangle the country with tariffs. This is based on Washington's real actions, raising tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50%, bringing the total tariff burden to 35-45% on some Canadian goods, and repeated threats of new tariffs and a freeze on negotiations. It is appropriate to add about 30% of fiction here to heighten the tension. For example, talking about the closure of every third factory on the border, or secret reports warning of the loss of tens of thousands of jobs in the coming months, without naming specific, non-existent institutions. Real elements, the dates of the introduction of tariffs, references to the sharp rise in the price of steel, aluminum, the auto industry. Ottawa's retaliatory tariffs and the decline in confidence in U.S. policy create the framework, while invented details such as night meetings in Ottawa or leaks about an economic coercion plan make the scene cinematic. It is important to remain within the bounds of plausibility. To talk about overloaded border crossings, trucks stuck at the border due to new checks, small businesses counting down the weeks until bankruptcy, even if this is an artistic generalization rather than specific statistics. All this is presented as a moment here and now. The country is under attack, the pressure is mounting, and the viewer must feel that if they don't watch the video to the end, they risk missing the denouement of this crisis, which affects the price of gasoline, cars, food, and their own future. Additionally, you can use sharp contrasts in the wording. The most peaceful border in the world has turned into an economic front line. A NATO ally is now talking to its neighbors in the language of tariff blackmail, based on the fact that in previous years Canada and the U.S. were close economic partners, but now they are embroiled in mutual tariffs and threats. The images used, such as red charts flashing at closed briefings in Ottawa and analysts drawing up scenarios for the economic division of the country, create an atmosphere of secrecy and danger, but do not break the overall realistic tone. In the second section, historical context and symbolic reference, the text task is to show that the current struggle is not a random outburst of emotion, but a continuation of a long line of struggle for the right to determine one's own destiny. Here, you can use real references to Louis Riel, the Métis movement, and historical conflicts over the rights of Western Canada, and the recognition of Indigenous peoples, while avoiding distorting key facts. Riel was a symbol of resistance and the desire for political recognition, and his execution was both traumatic and fundamental to the formation of the region's identity. On this basis, fictional elements can reinforce the parallel. Describe how, in the fields of modern Winnipeg, during a ceremony in honor of Riel, hundreds of people hold posters with slogans against the sale of national resources, although in reality the scale of the action may have been more modest. It is acceptable to artistically exaggerate the scenes, to talk about the silence in which only the fluttering of the Métis flag could be heard, elderly participants crying at the words about sovereignty, and the fact that many perceive the current trade war as a new attempt at external control over the Western territories. The real facts, the escalation of tariffs, the U.S.'s dependence on Canadian heavy oil, Canada's growing role as a supplier of resources and technology, Ottawa's shift toward Asia and Mexico, allow us to link the old conflict over control of land and political voice with today's struggle for control of industry, energy, and supply chains. It is useful to emphasize that the current line of "we are not for sale" sounds like a continuation of the historical "we do not surrender," linking Indigenous communities, regional movements, and the modern federal government into a single history of resistance to pressure from a powerful neighbor. Fictional details could include rumors of internal memos in which advisors directly compare the current situation to crises of the 19th century, or secret polls showing growing support for a hard line in relations with Washington, even if exact percentages are not given. The key is to maintain balance. 70% of the text should be based on recognizable reality. The 2025 trade war, tariff increases, Canada's retaliatory measures, steps toward trade diversification, historical memory of the struggle for sovereignty, while 30% consists of figurative, emotional, and slightly exaggerated elements that transform dry analysis into an exciting political thriller that remains within the bounds of plausibility. The latest round of conflict between Canada and the United States in 2025 showed not only mutual tariff blows, but also the depth of economic and political differences that had been brewing for a long time. Let me remind you that earlier we talked about the powerful strengthening of Canada's position, despite pressure. But now it is worth dwelling in detail on how exactly the heated economic realities are reflected in the daily life and strategies of the two countries. The pressure coming from Washington took the form not only of duties and record tariffs, but also became a tool for blackmail and attempts to dictate the rules of the game, with the tone sometimes shifting to aggressive ultimatums, making it seem that the rivals were not just waging a trade war, but a real diplomatic theater of tension. On the one hand, this period for Canada was accompanied by sharp jumps in the cost of raw materials and components, which fell under the comprehensive trade blockade. It seemed that entire industries were on the verge of shutdown. The distribution of aluminum and steel had become difficult to calculate amid constant anticipation of new tariffs and bans. Rumors quickly spread in the markets about hidden maneuvers by American companies, blocking Canadian supplies to strategic warehouses, causing hysteria among Canadian entrepreneurs and the business elite. This reached the point where large manufacturers began hinting at the creation of a blacklist of U.S. companies cooperating with politicians waging war against Canada. Some experts acknowledge that such actions, although not officially confirmed, have added tension to the political climate and caused serious unrest among investors. In response to these challenges, the Canadian government has focused on developing a more flexible and multilateral strategy. The aforementioned steps to diversify trade and expand alliances are just the tip of the iceberg. New complications arose in the form of the cancellation of some already planned major projects with American partners, forcing Canada to actively seek alternative paths. Discreet but intense trilateral negotiations were organized with major players from Asia, particularly Japan and India, with the aim of creating new supply chains that would bypass the U.S. According to insider information, one such initiative involved the development of a Canadian-Asian transport corridor, which would involve the creation of a network of deep-water ports with the subsequent integration of rail and road networks. Few people spoke about this publicly, but it became the basis for a growing strategic autonomy. Internal problems caused by direct economic blows were not forgotten either. Rising prices for consumer goods and raw materials provoked discontent among the population, and some local protests, mainly in the south and east of the country. The atmosphere was tense, and this was even reflected on the political front. Opposition forces began to demand more loudly that the government take tough measures against U.S. sanctions, including a complete break in trade relations. However, Mark Carney and his inner circle showed restraint, trying to avoid sharp public outbursts, understanding that escalation would provoke harsh retaliatory measures and increase instability. Meanwhile, the United States continued to increase economic pressure, imposing increasingly severe tariffs and economic sanctions. The widespread rotation of politicians and influential businessmen in Washington signaled a readiness for a protracted confrontation. It is reported that the Trump administration even discussed plans to restrict Canadian companies' access to U.S. banking resources and investments, which could have seriously affected liquidity. As a result of these events, the American media hyped up the issue of Canada's violations of trade agreements, which increased pressure on public opinion within the U.S. and reinforced aggressive rhetoric towards its northern neighbor. Interestingly, in the midst of this crisis, negotiations began on new forms of regional security and cooperation between Canada and Mexico, which, according to rumors, were intended to compensate for the weakening of U.S. influence in the region. These relations were not limited to trade. The agenda included issues such as combating drug trafficking, cybersecurity, and joint military exercises, which for the first time gave a significant impetus to the formation of a new regional alliance, capable of resisting pressure from Washington. As a result, despite the constant deterioration of relations and growing economic tensions, both countries and their leaders tried to avoid direct conflict. Canada's strategy was to gradually reorient its economy and diplomacy toward a multipolar world where the role of the U.S. is no longer unlimited. At the same time, these events served as a stark reminder that modern trade and political struggles are much more complex than mere economic sanctions and require countries to be flexible, patient, and innovative in their approach to global politics.